help you welcome him today. His name is Donnie Fleischauer. He's retired from the United States Air Force. He was a Master Sergeant and former Chief of the Presidential In-Flight Kitchen for Air Force One, and he served our country for 24 years. He worked his way to the top flight attendant assignment in the world, serving the crew of Air Force One during the presidential terms of Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. During that time, he made his way to running the entire kitchen for the Presidential Food Service Division. He has traveled over 100 countries in every corner of the world. Fleischauer has received the Meritorious Service Medal, 4 Commendation Medals, and 3 Joint Service Expeditionary Medals, in addition to many letters of appreciation from White House, State Department, and Pentagon staff. His unique position made his years in the Air Force unlike any other. He was able to stay in one location based out of Andrews Air Force Base, now called George Andrews, in Maryland. This is the place the city daughters, including myself, now all grown, grew up. After his retirement from the military in 1997, Fleischauer was recruited for a position of personal chef and assistant to a businessman and philanthropist, Brad Martin of Memphis, Tennessee. He moved his family to Memphis in 1997 and continued his craft for Martin, feeding his family and guests, including dignitaries, sports figures, politicians, and royalty. Fleischauer is now semi-retired and lives in the Memphis area with his wife, Dorothy. Please help me welcome Donnie Fleischauer. Turn your microphone. Oh, we also have a special Mr. Fleischauer has brought some memorabilia, and he's offered to give away 2 of the things. So if you kind of feel under your chair, there's 2 cards, and it has the presidential seal on it. If you have one of those, we have a little something for you. There's 2, so hold it up if you have one. There's the other one. All right, now these, don't eat these because they're old. This is a box of Bill Clinton M&Ms from the president. Don't eat them, they're old. And I have cards from the board he wanted to give a little something to you guys.
Good morning. As you know, I'm a former chef and a flight attendant originally on Air Force One. It was a long journey to get there. You know, I started right out of high school, joined the Air Force, and went into, of course, basic training. And out of basic training, I originally wanted to be a aerial photographer. And when I got out of the boot camp, the slots were filled for that particular school. So military either offers you another school, or you can wait and take your chances later on. So I decided to see what else was going on, and they had the flight traffic specialist school, which is another word for flight attendants and other enlisted crew members. So I took the school and became a flight attendant. It took about 6 weeks of schooling, and then I got assigned to Shreveport, Louisiana, to work for a general at the time, and that started my flying career. So that was pretty neat. Again, we learned cooking on board the airplane, which was totally new to me. I started my cooking career with, my father actually had a little restaurant, and he was in the Air Force himself. And he was in the food service career field, so I sort of picked up stuff naturally from him. And I didn't know then, as a kid, that later on in my life, I would be picking up where he left off. And later on, when I became the chef in Air Force One, the chef that I took over for actually worked for my dad. To show you how small the world was. And then I found out later on, too, that they didn't get along. You know. But they didn't really put 2 and 2 together until the last minute type of thing, but I got along with both of them, so it was okay. Then my second assignment was going up to Omaha, Nebraska, where I flew on the what they call the Doomsday plane. You had to have a super top secret clearance to get there, and then of course I had had one by then, and that was called Project Looking Glass, and that is now no more because they got other, you know, the Navy's taken over that role. But that was basically if the communications of the United States got taken out by other, missiles, by the direction of the President of the United States, we could launch missiles from the aircraft. And I had the privilege of actually turning the key one time on a practice missile shot out of Vandenberg Air Force Base, where you orbit over the Pacific Ocean, and they do the wartime sequencing, and they actually fire a practice missile. So they stay in practice all the time to make sure all the systems will work for wartime. So in case we had to, we could. So I have a little launch certificate to go along with that. That was, in the middle of the night, and then they take the airplane and vector you straight into the trajectory, and you see this thing lift off and fly up. And then it's a go, and then of course the mission's a success, and then the crew is qualified again for their wartime scenarios, which you never hope ever happens. But those particular flights are always 8 hours of flight time, and of course I took care of everybody on board, the battle staff and the flight crew, cooking, making sure that the 3-star general that's on board was comfortable and all that stuff. So it was interesting. That mission also was that the other airplane that would relieve you couldn't take off due to weather or maintenance, something like that. A lot of times you would be stuck in the air, so they would send an alert tanker out from another base to air refuel you, and then you're committed for another 8 hours. So on board the airplane there would be extra rations and water and such that I could commit to another 8-hour flight and feed the crew. And hopefully we wouldn't have to do it again, another 8 hours. Sir?
What aircraft was that?
There was an EC-135. It was a tanker. It looks like a 707 aerial tanker, but it has all the electronic gears inside, and it has a boom pod on it. So you can actually air refuel. You have your boom operator on board, and you have the receiver so you can take gas. So it was built that way. So it was top secret aircraft, but of course everybody knows about it. Then after that, I got notified of an assignment to go to Ramstein Air Base. The Andrews Air Force Base was starting up a distinguished visitors operation airlift out of Andrews, going to set up in Ramstein, and they needed the squadron, and I was one of the guys that was going to be there. So we started flying out of there. We had Jetstars, which were C-140s. It was a business jet built by Lockheed, and they carried 13 passengers. And then we had a C-135, which again, it was a tanker, but it didn't have a boom pod on it, and it was just strictly comfortable seating inside, first-class seating. And we accomplished, around the country, the Southwest Pacific, and then the Europe theaters. And that's where I picked up a lot of learning about flying with the Senate and in Congress. So we got, the typical junkets that you hear about. What they do is to make a mission a vacation. They can do 2 hours of business, and then they can do 10 or 12 days of pleasure. That's all they need to make the trip official. So that's their sneaky way of getting their trips through. Yeah, and so we've been to some real fancy places, and it's like, what are we doing here? And then you see your favorite friends there out on the beach or skiing. And we'd have several days off if we had time on the ground. And there's other times where they were actually working, and we'd be like 8 hours, 9 hours on the ground, and the next morning gear up, and we're flying. Those days, it was hard, because we'd have to, we were legally supposed to have 12 hours on the ground. with 8 hours minimum sleep. And because of being a VIP operation, we were given the extended duty days. So they said, okay, you didn't need that. Just do the mission. Sometimes that was really bad. I remember one time we were in Thailand and we left before sunrise, going to make it back to Washington, D.C., and we saw the sun 3 times before we got home. And that was really rough because, they spend time on the ground wherever you land. You have meetings with embassy officials and heads of state. And of course, we got to provide meals, so we don't sleep on the plane. We're up all the time. Oh, gee. After my Ramstein assignment, we went to, I got assigned to Andrews, and again, I started flying with the Congress and Senate, and did the same thing, but stateside. But again, we flew mostly overseas, did the same trips that I was just started out with, and after about a year and a half, I got selected to fly with the Vice President, then H.W. Bush. That was really unique and special to me. I'd flown with Vice President Bush at that time a little earlier, as he was a CIA director before. And because I had a clearance earlier and I was fit a certain profile, I got to fly with him, doing certain things with him before, so I was known to him. So I had a feeling that was probably why I got selected to be one of 2 of his personal flight attendants. So that was a really nice job to work with somebody that I sort of knew already. I already had an idea what his likes, dislikes were, and he was comfortable with me already. So that was wonderful. Let's see, it was about another year and a half. I got selected to join President Reagan on his presidential crew, which is a separate entity from the normal flying organization like I was flying with the Vice President and such. That is a hard crew, as we call it. There's a dedicated crew that's selected. Once you're on there, you're there for life or retirement, or if you do something wrong, you get fired. So I got selected for that. I was very happy, of course, and got to go to the White House to meet President Reagan, and then he congratulated me and all this stuff, right there in the Oval Office, and just you're in this historic place. But you had to go through all the security, get pat down so many times, going through, started at the main gate, Secret Service, and then the inner wall, until you're in the main office. Then I got to go downstairs and see the galley, as they call it, and that's the military, the Navy runs a galley, which is like a fast food establishment, but they cook everything, for their staff members and such. And then I was taken into the West Wing, and we got to see where the real chef, the White House chef, works. And of course, that's a big operation there. And then I got to go back to our little air base at Andrews, and where we have our own little kitchen. Back then, it was actually a small kitchen and office in an old hangar that was holding at the time, a 707 aircraft, which is one of the original 707s that you see. on a lot of the movies and such, and shortly after that, we got notified that we were going to get a 747, which is what you see flying around now, and also all the infrastructure that goes along with it, as a new hangar and support items, and it included a great big kitchen that was about 4,000 square feet. You can imagine that, but we got two 747s, and we would need to be able to prepare meals on the ground, that mostly entrees is what I did. And we'd have flash freezers, regular freezers, storage capacity, and all kind of other machinery. So we got frozen yogurt, things like that. When eventually when President Clinton came up, he had to get on a low-fat diet eventually, and that was one of the things, the transition from ice cream to low-fat yogurt, and it actually tastes pretty good. We had all kind of flavors to choose from, and he didn't care which one it was. He just sent it his way. And that was another thing about President Clinton. He loved, when we first started flying with him, he was a really great guy. I mean, he was like the neighbor next door. He was really friendly, and he would come up and talk with you and want to eat anything greasy. Hamburgers, tacos, whatever you got. That's what he wanted. He loved us, 3-5 layer cheese pizzas, whatever you can, come up with. And then eventually the White House doctor got a hold of us and said, no more. But at the same time, we're saying, hey, this is our commander-in-chief. He's our boss. What are we going to tell him? You can't have that. So it's like, oh dear. So eventually, by that time, I was being assigned, my part-time duty at that time was to be an assistant to the chef that we had working at the time. And then shortly after that, I started doing more and more in I was asked to become the permanent chef because our chef was retiring from the Air Force. And so I was able, I said, sure. I was getting tired of flying, this like 20-some years already of flying, and it was like, getting beat down, had 8,000 hours already of flying, and it's like, oh. So I said, sure. And it also entailed flying at times. So I could sort of pick and choose what flights I wanted and that kind of stuff. So I took the job and enjoyed that part of it. But we had all kind of fun. Sorry, I'm losing. But anyway, putting these meals together was a big thing. It started out at the White House. We get notified on a mission. Then we sort of plan the meals that we think is appropriate for the time factors. And then we have to submit it back to the White House. The White House yeas or nays or adds, subtracts, whatever. And then we would go to the various supermarkets around town, and then have to purchase the items ourselves. Number one is for security, because the White House, the Secret Service would want to make sure that we personally picked out everything that goes on that airplane, and it would be for the president. So everything that happens to that plane is security, from baggage, water, fuel, everything is security. Then once that is accomplished, we bring the food back to the kitchen. The kitchen, then it's separated by days and then by separate meals, and then we also start the process of cooking the entrees. And then comes the flash freezing, and we put them in these little metal pans that we can put in the ovens in our galley on the airplane and finish them off. And then we have the vegetables and starches and whatever else we need to finish off our meals. We do that in flight. And then I also introduced what we call par-baked breads, rolls that we can do in the airplane, which I would do on the ground and bake to about 85–90% done, and then flash freeze them, and then finish them off in the oven on the plane. So we have fresh bread, you have yeast aroma, and it's sort of like, everybody loved that. He says, bring it on, bring the butter on. So that was kind of unique in itself, having fresh bread on the plane. Then I got a little story about President Bush one time. He was, during one of the campaigns, he came on board the plane one time. He's usually on a rush. He's running all the time. He never sat down and relaxed. He was always working on the plane. Most people think that when you get on the Air Force One, that it's all fun and games and stuff, but no, it's a flying office, and they're usually always working hard. And President Bush was one of those guys that always worked hard. And he came on the plane one day after one of the campaigning trips, and he had his tie on, and he whipped his tie off, and he says, "Donnie, you've cleaned this. I got a food stain on here." And I said, "Well, yes, sir, I'll try." So we did one of our tricks is using tonic water. And tonic water is a little quinine. A lot of times we'll take a little stain out of your clothing and stuff. And I said, "Oh, hope it's not grease, because then it wouldn't work very well." We had a trick for grease too, but it smelled too bad, using brake fluid, brake cleaner. We carry that too, so, but it wouldn't smell too good. But I did that, and of course I brought the tie back up to him after it dried, and then next thing I know, he's handing me his pants. He's wearing his gym shorts, his jogging suit. He always had that on board when he wanted to relax. And he said, "Can you press these?" And I said, "Sure, yes, sir." And of course, I take it back to the back galley, and we have a ironing board and iron, and I got a damp towel on there, and I did the ironing trick, and it wasn't that bad actually, but I pressed it for him, put a nice little crease in there for him, and brought it back up to him, and he just smiled and took them back from me, and he says, "Thank you, okay." Oops. But part of his favorite snacks would be anything, nachos, popcorn, and that's the kind of things he would want on the side, while he was working, just something he can grab. And another meal that I did one time that was on a President Bush mission was I did a beef Wellington individual servings. It was a White House requested meal of some kind of steak meal, but we only had about an hour, 20 minutes to accomplish that, and it was from Houston to Dallas, and normally it's a faster flight than that, because Air Force One usually, the 707 at the time would fly faster than that, but the pilot was going to drag his feet a little bit, so to speak, and give us a little extra time. But I came up with this beef Wellington. This tenderloin cooks fast, but at the same time you don't want to do it too fast, because it'll be a piece of leather. So we came up with that plan to do the Wellington. I had it all set up ahead of time. We had a few hours on the ground in Houston to put this meal together, and we started cooking it right before takeoff, and had all the, of course, all the sides and things were put together, and we had our trays is what we use to serve the meals on. So we just had a tray carrier with all the meals ready to go, and then once we were airborne, let's slam them. You just take it out there and give everybody their meals. But the problem was with the beef Wellington is covered in pastry, puff pastry, and there's no way for me to really be able to tell if the meat was going to be where I want it. You want it medium rare to rare. And so I was taking a chance, and I was sort of timing it and looking, eyeballing the pastry at the same time. But all in all, it turned out great. Put the meal out, and we got it done on time. Got the trays back on descent to Dallas. And then I found out later, Marlon Fitzwater, who was the press secretary, had put out a press release on the meal, which has never been done. He was so impressed with it, it's like, oh, okay. And, it's like, okay, I love it. And then there was another story about President Clinton. This came from the Secret Service guys. Sometimes they would talk. And there were one time I don't remember if it was in Arkansas or somewhere, but we were in the middle of the day, and we did serve lunch. And so President Clinton did eat, and they were on their way to another event, and the Secret Service said they were driving along, and all of a sudden President Clinton said, whoa, 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 stop the car. So they stopped, and it was a mom and pop hamburger joint. And guess what he wanted? A greasy cheeseburger. And he got it. And so the Secret Service says, oh my gosh, this guy can eat. And then President Reagan did a meal for him one time. Normally on the planes, we carry 3 or 4 different entrees that the president and first family likes. Because we never know if what their mood is for eating, and also if they want what's served on the plane that day for that particular meal. So one day he came, normally he would eat what was being served, but one day he wanted, he says, do you have meatloaf? And we know that was one of his favorites. Not many people think about it, but from his generation, meatloaf was a staple. And he had asked, you got that? And I said, well, we'll fix you up. And we had it. We put it together and served this meatloaf with mac cheese and applesauce. And that's what you serve a president of the United States. And everybody's like, oh my gosh, you didn't. But that's one of the things that he wanted. And then we, a little tidbit of funny thing on Mrs. Reagan. She'd always bring her dog on some of these trips, and we messed around with the Marines who flew the HMX helicopters that you see deliver the president to and from Air Force One. And we had this, a couple of the Marines came up and asked us one time when we had a downtime, does the dog ever go to the bathroom on the plane? And we said, never. And the helicopter guy says, well, the dog always seems to want to go before we get to the White House. And then we're, sort of looking at each other, and we're trying to keep from laughing. And what the deal was, we were feeding the dog on descent. And the dog, dogs normally got to go within a few minutes after they eat. So the first place the dog's got to go, is usually in the helicopter, because the helicopter is vibrating, so that's probably not helping the dog any. So we were sort of goosing the Marines at the same time. But that's when Mrs. Reagan would feed the dog, so it was like, okay. So we're taking the thumbs up on the Marines on that. So, but again, that brings us to part of the logistics of Air Force One is when you see it flying, you only see Air Force One, but it's like a pyramid. You have cargo planes that have to travel and carry the limos, stairs, support equipment for the cars, and then support people. It just keeps on trickling down until you got this great big pyramid. And then you have embassy people involved, State Department people involved in all these countries. They've got to secure fuel, test fuel, and nothing goes on that plane without it being tested. And you got to have, the bomb-sniffing dogs for baggage. If they're spending a night somewhere, all of the logistics has got to be taken care of baggage-wise. That's taken care of by Army. All the services are part of the organization, so nobody's left out. Navy takes care of communications on the ground. It just goes on and on and on. So, what you see is just the tip of the iceberg. So most of the people in the country don't understand that there's more to the president than what you see. So, that's part of the expenses. A lot of times you hear about, it's Air Force One's going to cost you, a gazillion $1 million, but they don't tell you about all the infrastructure and the support that has to go to support that airplane. But that's just part of the government. A lot of times we carry guests on board the plane, and we have like movie stars, sports people, and stuff like that on there. A lot of times they're, sit with the president and such like that, so we have very little contact with them. But it's kind of unique to see, these people that you see on TV show up, and if you're working the aisle, as we call it, you get to serve them and whatnot. But if you're in the galley, you never see them. So, oh yeah, they're on the plane. But it's interesting. Sometimes they'll come around and talk with you, and shake your hand and such. But we weren't allowed to go out and introduce yourself or try to get a picture like most people would try to do. Excuse me. Then another meal that I put out one time that was, again, kind of unique, but not, was we went with President Bush to Riyadh during Desert Shield. That was the precursor to Desert Storm. We were there during Thanksgiving, and he met with the Saudi king and prince. And while they were out there, we were going to have a Thanksgiving meal on board the Air Force One on the ground. And the staff members, of course, went with President Bush to the meeting. And we had, I went ahead and fed the crew their meal. And President Bush at the time invited General Schwarzkopf at the time and his battle staff to use our airplane for communications, as we were the most secure communications available in that theater at the time. So while they were there, we got to feed them too, and have their fresh turkey dinner, and which of course he enjoyed and said thanks. And shortly thereafter, President Bush came back, and of course we fed him also their turkey dinner. So that was kind of unique. I was sitting out there in the desert having Thanksgiving dinner, and it was sort of out in blackout conditions because we were under threat of missile attack at the time. It was, everybody knew we were there, and then you get all the threats that come along with it. But nothing came of that. So that was kind of unique. Okay. Let's see, I got some pictures up here. There's me with President Reagan. That was when I got selected to come up to the White House. This one here is the day I found out I got selected to the president, to work with President Reagan. And of course, this is, the crew members on the front galley with President Reagan and the new 747, the first flight. Let's see. And this is the Air Force One chef that I replaced. And if you can believe it, that was a 12-pound lobster. Somebody brought that for us, and we said, wow, it's really something else. I don't remember how long it took to cook, but it didn't take long to finish off eating them. Then I took a screenshot of a History Channel movie of me on there. Of course, they took about 10 minutes of film on me, but it was only like 3 seconds of me on it. But I remember we were doing Polynesian chicken and rice.